What I think is so interesting about this passage, and you heard it in the words that I emphasized, it starts off by speaking of the father. The wandering Aramaean was my father. Speaking of the father in the third person, as if it's telling someone else's story. He, right? He went down into Egypt and sojourned there, and he became a nation, great and mighty. But in the course of telling the story, there's this subtle switch into the first person. And then we, right? The Egyptians treated us harshly and humiliated us. A switch into the first person, even though those events didn't happen to the speaker any more than going down into Egypt as the wandering Aramaean happened to the speaker. Moses is, after all, talking to the generation after the generation that witnessed the redemption. That switch from the third person to the first person, I think, is a way of saying that even if you weren't there, every Jew must see himself or herself in this nation's story, in its history. Every Jew has to read themselves into the past, into the collective memory, as if they were there. So in the previous passage, in Exodus 12, we had the non-native performing the memory of the collective in the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, or if circumcised, then even in the Passover sacrifice. But in this passage, we see that even a native-born person must actively read themselves into the history and the collective memory, consciously choose to take on that collective memory, because it didn't happen to them personally either. The memory of collectives is always, throughout your generations, an act of imagination. The rabbis, I think, demonstrate their awareness that collective memory is always an act of imagination by which we read ourselves into a community story. When they describe the wicked child at Passover, right? The wicked child at Passover is the one who says, "What is all this for you?" Not for us, for you. The wicked child refuses to read himself into the nation's story. This is your memory, not mine. It's your story, not mine. And so it's your responsibility, not mine. And so his identity as a member of the community is compromised if he doesn't choose to read himself into the collective memory. So I just want to repeat that very important point. Collective memory, unlike individual memory, must be actively taught, and it has to be actively accepted, even by the native-born, because, in fact, they too were not there at the original moment that's being remembered. So a community whose collective identity is grounded in memory is a community in which membership requires an active imagination, it requires a lot of teaching and learning, and it requires intentionality because one must accept the memory as one's own. I want to make one very important last point about memory before we move on to our second category. To take ownership of a collective memory means to take responsibility. It's an ethical act. It means to take responsibility for that memory and its consequences. There is an ethical aspect to memory. Memory is what creates personal identity over time. I'm the same person I was 40 years ago, not because I have the same physical body parts. In fact, I don't. There's probably not a cell in my body that's the same as any cell that was in my body 40 years ago. And of course, we all lose hair and nails and teeth and physical pounds as well. I'm the same person I was 40 years ago because I remember what that young person did, and I own it. I remember that I fed pigeons in Venice or that I climbed Ayers Rock in Australia. It's memory and not physical continuity that gives me my continuing personal identity across time. Memory is important for identity because it makes us responsible for things.